In the weeks that followed his quiet moment on the balcony, Robert Baratheon threw himself more fiercely into the tasks of rulership. The dawn of winter did not bring a sudden chill to King's Landing as it might have done in the north, but it cooled the capital just enough to send many small folk scurrying for warmer cloaks and thicker blankets. Robert took note of this in passing, for the crown had organized limited distributions of wool and food in the poorest districts. It was not a full solution by any means. Poverty still stalked the twisting streets of Flea Bottom, but the relief efforts showed that the king's interest in his people was more than a passing fancy. The gold cloaks set up stations in key areas to protect the distribution, ensuring the supplies went to the needy rather than to black market profiteers. Robert rarely performed these inspections alone. Ned Stark often accompanied him, along with a handful of trusted knights, including Ser Barristan Selmy. Though Robert's presence was enough to cow most would-be thieves, he found that the presence of the Hand and the legendary Lord Commander gave an additional sense of legitimacy to these tasks. The small folk marveled that the king himself bothered to ride through the narrower streets and crooked lanes, stopping at watch posts where the gold cloaks huddled around braziers. Robert would ask questions, gesturing now and then to the crates of supplies. He was keen to hear if any shipments had been waylaid, if any shipments had gone missing. In past years, he would not have troubled himself with these details, leaving them to whomever served as master of coin or master of laws. But times had changed, and so had he. On one such inspection, Robert's group came upon a small crowd gathered in the courtyard of an old, half-ruined building. The murmur of anxious voices carried to the king's ears as he dismounted, the courtyard's cobblestones slick from a recent drizzle. Ned dismounted behind him, ever watchful. The gold cloaks stepped aside, granting the king a view of the cause for alarm: a battered woman holding a child. The woman looked up, eyes widening when she recognized him. She tried to sink into a curtsy, but she was trembling and badly bruised. Robert felt a wave of anger surge through him. "What happened here?" he asked, voice steady but cold. A watchman in a gold cloak cleared his throat. "Your Grace, it seems this woman's husband beat her and threatened the child. He fled when we arrived, but we have men searching the alleys. She's had a rough time of it." Once, Robert might have muttered something indistinct and continued on, telling the watch to handle it. But now he stared at the woman's bruised face, at the way the child clung to her skirts in silent terror. He felt the old warrior's fury rise. He reached into a pouch at his belt. He carried no gold dragons on his person in the old days, but these days he kept a few coins for moments such as this, and pressed them into her hand. "See that a maester looks after you and the boy," he said. Then he turned to the watchman. "I want that man found. If he has friends hiding him, you root them out. No one in my city beats a mother and child without answering for it." The watchmen saluted, their expressions a mix of surprise and resolve. Robert gestured for a knight to guide the woman and her child toward a safe shelter. As they left, Ned gave Robert a somber nod. It was a small moment, a single act, but such gestures did not go unnoticed. A king's compassion could be as powerful as his sword arm in winning the loyalty of the people. They rode on, continuing their rounds until late afternoon. The winter sun sat low in the sky when they finally returned to the Red Keep. Robert dismounted with a weary sigh, handing the reins of his charger to a stable boy. Despite his tired limbs, he felt that day's labor had been well spent, more satisfying than any idle carouse in the past. He caught Ned's eye, and the two men shared a rare smile of understanding before parting ways to attend to other duties. Inside, the castle corridors were alight with torches. Courtiers bustled about, and Robert could practically taste the swirl of intrigue. He had grown more adept at sensing it, a skill he'd never wanted before but now had forced himself to learn. Varys's little birds brought him rumors daily, whispers of hidden alliances, bribes offered to minor officials, occasional talk of dethroning the king. The more Robert strengthened his grip on the realm, the more certain factions resisted, whether openly or in the shadows. As he climbed the steps toward the solar he now used as a private office, he encountered Peter Baelish, who stood near a window, observing the courtyard below. Littlefinger offered a thin smile as Robert approached, inclining his head in a respectful greeting. "Your Grace," he said lightly. "Back from your afternoon of vigilant justice, I see. How noble." Robert eyed him, detecting a faint sarcasm. "A king should be aware of what happens in his own city," Robert said, matter of fact. Littlefinger nodded, unperturbed. "Indeed, and it seems you've found a new taste for these personal inspections. One wonders how long you'll keep it up." "Long enough," Robert growled. He did not like Peter Baelish. He found the man cunning, manipulative, forever mocking, but he also recognized his value in the role of Master of Coin. Or at least, that had been Baelish's role until Robert had begun to question his management. "Is there something you need, Baelish?" "Only to inform you that the next round of Treasury reports is ready." Littlefinger tapped the side of his head. "So many numbers swirling about, I fear I'll start dreaming in columns of coin. Would you prefer them delivered to your solar, or shall we discuss them in the council chamber tomorrow?" "Send them to my solar. I'll review them tonight." Robert turned to go, but paused. "And Peter?" "Yes, Your Grace. Remember that I'll be reading them carefully." A flicker of amusement crossed Littlefinger's features. "Of course, I wouldn't expect otherwise. Good evening, Your Grace." Robert continued up the stairs, ignoring the prickle of annoyance that always accompanied any exchange with Littlefinger. He pushed open the door to his solar, where a brazier glowed in one corner, fighting back the chill. He felt a brief wave of longing for the hammered silver goblet that used to sit on his desk, perpetually filled with wine. But instead of reaching for it, he settled for a cup of warm spiced cider brought by a servant. The sweetness was a poor substitute for the old burn of alcohol, yet it reminded him of the vow he had made. In that vow lay his strength. As he awaited the treasury reports, he sifted through letters from the various lords and knights who served him. Some were simple updates on local affairs. Others were more urgent. A note from Lord Tully regarding a suspicious increase in river raids, possibly by outlaws or ironborn. A letter from House Tyrell, detailing their upcoming harvest festivals and expressing a polite desire that the king grace them with a visit come spring. Robert made mental notes to address each matter in the next council meeting. Keeping abreast of the realm's thousand threads was exhausting, but he found it left him oddly fulfilled at the end of the day. He had once chased ephemeral pleasures, or else drowned himself in the numbness of drink. Now, though the burdens were heavy, he felt a sense of clear purpose. When Littlefinger's scribe arrived with the treasury reports, Robert dismissed his attendants and spread the parchments across his desk. It was a tangled mess of expenditures, loans, revenues, and lines of credit from across Westeros and beyond. House Lannister still held a considerable note of debt against the crown, as did the Iron Bank of Bravos. Robert had begun the delicate task of renegotiating terms, paying down some of the most onerous obligations. He scanned each column, trying to piece together the puzzle of the crown's finances. Littlefinger's handwriting was crisp, but the intricacies were maddening. Yet Robert persevered. He marked certain lines that seemed suspicious or excessively vague. If Baelish had hidden anything, skimmed coin, disguised transactions, Robert intended to find it. He might not have the cunning of Peter Baelish, but that was why he had begun to consult with Ned Stark and even Stannis, by Raven at least, for clarity on the kingdom's finances. His younger brother, though joyless, possessed a rigid sense of duty and a sharp analytical mind. Robert intended to use that to keep the realm's gold from slipping through cracks. Late that night, he rubbed his temples. His eyes burned from reading so many ledgers by firelight. But he had done it. He had a short list of items to question Littlefinger about in the next council session. Feeling a sense of achievement, he tidied the parchments. The impetus of the day's events still thrummed in his veins, preventing him from finding rest immediately. He rose, pacing the solar. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He noted the breadth of his shoulders, still formidable, and the slight lines on his face that had deepened over the years. Gray touched his hair and beard, but his eyes, those were still full of the old spirit, a spark that had once blazed on battlefields. He left the solar, descending a spiral staircase that led to one of the castle's internal courtyards. The sky overhead was a speckled canvas of stars. The night air was cold but bracing. He inhaled deeply, calming the restless energies within. Down below, the city slept, or at least the majority did. In the distance, occasional torchlight glimmered along the walls, where guards patrolled. He thought of the people living there, from the wealthiest merchant in the Street of Silk to the poorest beggar in Flea Bottom. Many had endured hardships in recent years. A stable crown meant stability in their lives. A drunken, disinterested king had allowed lawlessness and corruption to spread. Now he was trying to undo that damage. He could not wave a hand and fix everything, but he was determined to make progress. He returned to his chambers and finally lay down, mind too full for an easy sleep. His dreams came late and were fragmented. He saw flashes of the past. Lyanna Stark's face, half hidden in blue winter roses. The horrifying image of Rhaegar Targaryen's ruby-studded armor as it sank into the waters of the Trident. Then the Iron Throne itself loomed, swords twisting, forming a cage around him. He awoke before dawn, heart pounding, the memory of those swords lingering in the gloom. He rose without calling for wine. Instead, he dressed, splashed cold water on his face, and made for the training yard, where the first hints of morning light had begun to chase away the stars. A small group of knights and squires already practiced with blunted weapons. They bowed or saluted when they saw him, hurrying to let him pass. Robert approached the weapon racks. He selected a hefty training sword that mimicked the weight of a real blade. Ser Barristan arrived soon after, offering a quick bow. "You've become quite the early riser, Your Grace," the old knight remarked. Robert tested the practiced sword's balance. "I sleep less, it seems. The realm gives me plenty to think about." Barristan gestured for a squire to bring him a blunted longsword. No rest for a king, it appears. They began a series of drills, the ring of steel echoing across the yard. Robert's breath made puffs of steam in the chill air. He swung and blocked, forcing Barristan to move in a circle. The older knight, though still nimble, could not match Robert's raw strength, but he had skill and cunning that demanded every bit of Robert's focus. After a few moments, Robert unleashed a powerful overhead blow. Barristan managed to parry, but the force knocked him back half a step. A murmured cheer rose from the onlookers. Robert pressed his advantage, driving Barristan toward the edge of the practice ground. Then, in a flash of movement, Barristan ducked sideways, letting Robert's momentum carry him forward, where the king nearly stumbled. Laughter rippled among the bystanders, not at the king's expense, but in the exhilaration of the spar. Robert grinned, straightening. "Tricky old man," he said between ragged breaths. Barristan inclined his head. "One must be, to keep pace with Your Grace." They continued until Robert's muscles burned. He relished the sensation. It was the burn of honest exertion, far removed from the throbbing pain of a hangover. When they finished, Robert found himself panting but invigorated. He clapped Barristan on the shoulder and dismissed him, ignoring the ache in his arms that would remind him of this bout all day. He had other duties to tend to now. By the time Robert made his way to the council chamber, the day had fully dawned. The torches on the walls had been extinguished, replaced by the bright glow filtering through high windows. Seated around the table were the usual suspects: Ned Stark, Grand Maester Pycelle, Peter Baelish, Varys, and Renly Baratheon. Cersei did not typically attend these meetings unless it concerned her or the children directly, though the king sometimes considered whether he should insist on her presence. Today, he decided he did not care for the added friction. He eased himself into the head chair and cast a glance around the table. "Let's begin," he said. Ned cleared his throat, scanning the notes in front of him. "We've received reports that certain houses in the Crownlands are displeased with the new tax structures. House Faring, among others, claims it cannot meet the additional levy." Littlefinger tapped a finger on the table. "If they cannot meet it, they should provide a clear accounting. Too many lords cry poverty yet maintain a household of 100 retainers. I suspect House Faring can pay," but chooses not to. Ned nodded. Indeed, we can send a royal agent to inspect their ledgers, if that pleases your grace. Robert exhaled. House Faring had once boasted their loyalty to him during the rebellion. Now they played games with coin. Do it, he said. Let them know that if they're truly in dire straits, we'll grant them leniency, but if they're lying, they'll face fines. The crown can't be cheated. Next item. Baelish shuffled his papers. The cost of maintaining the city watch has risen since you've expanded their duties, your grace. Equipment, wages, benefits for families of the watchmen. These are all noble endeavors, but they require funding. Robert looked at Ned, then Renly, then back to Baelish. We'll find the coin, perhaps cut some of the more frivolous expenses in the royal household. I won't reduce the city watch's resources, not when we've only just gotten them in shape. Renly spoke up, his tone light but thoughtful. We could also negotiate some trade concessions with the free cities. If we bring in more commerce through King's Landing, we'll have a wider tax base. The new roads and improved security should make that attractive. Master Baelish, perhaps you could encourage certain foreign merchants to do more business here. Baelish inclined his head with a faint smirk. An intriguing idea, Lord Renly. I believe I can handle some negotiations discreetly. Robert eyed Littlefinger, half tempted to object to the man's involvement. But, for the moment, Baelish's skills were too valuable to discard. Fine. See to it, he said. Next. Varys leaned forward, his soft hands folding on the table. I have news from the east, your grace. Whispers about the Targaryen girl. She's said to be in Meereen now with her dragons. The word dragons settled uneasily over the room. Ned's brows drew together. Pycelle huffed in skepticism. Renly pursed his lips. Robert felt his stomach twist at the mention. He forced his voice to remain calm. So the rumors are true then? She has living dragons? Varys tilted his head. So it is whispered, your grace. The truth is elusive, but enough ships returning from Slaver's Bay speak of sightings, of illusions or wonders. Where there is smoke, one might suspect a fire. Ned raised an eyebrow. Even if she has dragons, the seas separate her from us. She can't threaten Westeros without a fleet, and raising such a fleet in Essos to cross the narrow sea with dragons in tow would take time. Time can be fleeting, Varys added softly, especially if the Dothraki or other Sellsword companies rally to her cause. We must be vigilant. Robert recalled his old vow to rid the world of Targaryens. Yet that vow had been made in the haze of hatred and personal tragedy. Did he still hunger for her death as once he had? He closed his eyes briefly, remembering the devastation Rhaegar's war had caused. But he was not the same man. Daenerys was barely more than a girl, fatherless, motherless, an exile her entire life. Keep an ear to the ground, he told Varys. If she truly means to threaten us, we'll be ready. But I won't send killers across the sea to murder a girl and her rumored beasts. Not unless we know for sure. It was a notable shift in policy, and everyone in the room knew it. Pycelle seemed unsettled, glancing sideways as though waiting for the king to bark an order for the girl's head. Littlefinger blinked, his eyes calculating. Renly hid a mild surprise under a sip of wine. Ned, for his part, looked quietly relieved, though he said nothing. Robert knew he had once asked Ned to assassinate Daenerys in the original timeline. But not this Robert, not anymore. They continued with the agenda. Trade pacts, the condition of the Royal Navy, a plague rumor in Old Town that turned out to be a local sickness, quickly contained. By the time the session ended, the sun was high in the sky, and Robert's stomach growled. As the council members dispersed, Ned lingered by the table, organizing his notes. Robert waited until the others had left before speaking. You disapprove of letting Daenerys live, don't you? Robert asked, though softly. Ned glanced up. On the contrary, I approve. Killing an innocent girl halfway across the world, without proof she intends us harm. It never sat well with me. Robert nodded, an ache in his chest. I know. I was a fool to demand it before. Let's pray it doesn't come back to haunt us. Ned tucked the parchments under his arm. If she truly has dragons and means to invade, we'll have time to prepare. You've tightened the realm's unity. That may prove vital if the day comes when we must defend ourselves. They left the council chamber. Robert made his way to the great hall, where a small midday meal was laid out for him. A chunk of roasted venison, bread, and fresh fruit. He ate heartily, but not gluttonously, and drank watered ale to quench his thirst. A few courtiers hovered, seeking a moment to appeal for favor or present trifling matters. Robert waved them away. His midday meal was one of the few times he allowed himself some privacy. Afterward, he decided to visit the royal stables to check on the horses that had recently arrived from the Reach. Magnificent destriers gifted by Lord Tyrell as a gesture of goodwill. He strode through the castle corridors, cloak swishing around his boots, exchanging nods with guards and servants. For a man who once saw these stone hallways as the site of endless tedium, Robert now found them almost homely. They were filled with the daily thrum of a kingdom in motion, a kingdom he had come to view as his responsibility rather than his burden. He reached the stables, where the smell of hay and manure mixed with the sharper scent of horse sweat. Grooms bustled about, combing manes and cleaning stalls. Robert found the new destriers in a large pen near the far wall, each a shining example of breeding. One was a dark bay with a white stripe on its face. Another, a dappled gray with powerful legs. Robert ran a hand over the gray's flank, feeling the beast's strength. He turned at the sound of hooves on stone. Jaime Lannister rode in, dismounting with a flourish. The Kingslayer, clad in gilded armor, seemed as proud as ever. He tossed the reins to a groom and caught sight of Robert. For a moment, the air between them tightened. Their relationship had always been complicated, overshadowed by the knowledge that Jaime had killed the Mad King, and by the countless rumors swirling about him and Cersei. "Your Grace," Jaime said, bowing with a polite smirk. "Inspecting the new gifts from Highgarden?" Robert inclined his head, stepping away from the gray destrier. "That I am. Fine beasts, each of them." Jaime's gaze flicked briefly to the horse, then back to Robert. "Lord Tyrell's generosity is boundless, or so he'd have us think." Robert let the remark pass. He turned again toward the gray. "I've been meaning to name this one, something that befits a horse of war. Suggestions?" Jaime shrugged. "I'm hardly one to name your beasts, Your Grace, but if it were mine, I'd name it Ironbreaker or Stormchaser. Something that evokes your house sigil, perhaps." Robert let a small grin tug at his mouth. "Stormchaser. That has a ring to it." They lapsed into silence for a moment. Robert could practically hear the unspoken tension between them. Jaime was not just any knight. He was the Queen's twin, a man rumored to be far more to her than a brother. There was a time Robert would have confronted him in a wine-fueled rage. Now he weighed his words more carefully. "How fares the Queen?" Robert finally asked, voice neutral. Jaime's smirk wavered. "She is well so far as I know. We speak little about her daily routines." A lie, Robert thought, but he let it go. "Tell her I'll be joining her for dinner," he said. "There are matters we must discuss." Jaime inclined his head and turned to go, but paused. "Your Grace, if I may, I've noticed the changes in you. The realm notices too. Be mindful that not everyone welcomes these changes. Some prefer the king who was content to feast and let them do as they please." Robert held Jaime's gaze. "I'm aware. Let them be displeased. The realm comes first." Jaime offered no reply and walked away, spurs clinking. Robert remained for another few minutes, stroking the horse's neck and considering Jaime's words. He knew well that many lords had profited from his previous inattention. They would grow bolder or more cunning in their resistance, yet Robert refused to yield. He might not have the subtlety of a Varys or a Littlefinger, but he had steel in his spirit and good men around him. That would have to suffice. That evening, Robert approached the Queen's chambers. He rarely spent time there of late. Their marriage had deteriorated into a performance, a stage upon which they wore matching masks for the sake of the realm. Even so, Robert had insisted they dine together, if only to maintain a semblance of unity. Outside the chamber doors, a pair of Lannister guards straightened. Robert frowned at their presence. Once it would have been normal to see such guards, but now it irritated him that Cersei so openly employed her own men. Still, he said nothing and pushed the door open. Cersei was seated near the window, wearing a gown of deep emerald embroidered with lions, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders. At a glance, she could have been mistaken for a vision of courtly grace. But Robert knew better. Her green eyes flicked toward him, and her lips curved into a tight, thin smile. "You summoned me, husband," she said, her voice smooth yet cold. "I suggested we dine," Robert corrected, crossing the room. A table had been set with roasted pheasant, fresh bread, and wine. He noted 2 cups on the table. "I trust you received word?" Cersei rose, moving with elegant poise. She poured wine into both cups, took one for herself, and left the other conspicuously untouched. "Yes, I did. I was curious to see if you meant to follow through." Robert sat, feeling a spark of irritation. "We're a king and queen, are we not? We should act like it." Cersei took a sip of her wine, eyes never leaving him. "How noble of you. Are we to pretend harmony for the court? Or is there something else you want from me?" Robert clenched his jaw. The old Robert might have roared or thrown a goblet. Instead, he breathed deeply, remembering his vow of sobriety and self-control. "We have children," he said quietly, "and if we cannot be civil for each other's sake, we should at least do it for theirs. With winter coming, the realm can ill afford the rumor of discord between us." Cersei arched an eyebrow. "You speak as though you suddenly care for them as a father ought." Her words were a barb, and Robert felt them sink in. He thought of Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, and of the doubts swirling in his mind about their parentage. But he did not voice that. "I am trying," he said flatly. "Now that I'm not drowning in wine every day, I see how far things have fallen." She set her wine aside. "And so you seek to rebuild your image, to become the fatherly king beloved by the realm, to overshadow your prior deficiencies?" There was a sneer in her tone. "Yes," he snapped, "if that's what it takes. The realm needs stability. Our children need stability." Cersei rolled her eyes. "Are you sure it's stability you want? Or simply a new set of illusions? Men love to forge pretty myths about themselves. Robert the strong, Robert the just, Robert the reformed. Does it ease your conscience?" Robert's temper flared. He nearly stood, fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain seated. "Watch your tongue, woman," he warned, though his voice was lower than it would have been in years past. "I'm no longer so easy to bait." A moment of silence stretched. Cersei studied him, as if noticing something different. She let out a soft, mirthless laugh. "There was a time you would have struck me for such words, or at least threatened it. I suppose that's your grand improvement." He exhaled sharply. "Believe what you will. I've changed for the sake of the realm. Like it or not, you are still my queen. I'd prefer we work together, at least publicly." Cersei took another sip of wine, gazing at him over the rim of her cup. "Very well," she murmured. "For the sake of appearances, I'll do my part. But don't expect me to become your adoring wife overnight." She set the cup down with a snap. "And as for the children, you should speak with Joffrey. He's grown restless, with all these new restrictions you've placed on the court." Robert had expected this. "I'll speak with him. He needs discipline. He can't be allowed to flit about tormenting servants and ignoring the rule of law." Cersei's eyes flashed. "He's our son. You would do well to remember that." A bitter taste rose in Robert's mouth. "I remember," he said quietly. "Shall we eat before the pheasant goes cold?" He gestured to the food, hoping to quell the rising tension. They ate mostly in silence, an uneasy truce established for the moment. Robert drank water with his meal, ignoring the wine. Cersei noticed, of course, but made no remark. He caught her glancing at his face more than once, as if searching for signs of weakness or cracks in his new resolve. He wondered if she was disappointed not to see them. By the time the meal ended, they parted with cool civility. Robert left her chambers feeling as if he'd marched through a battlefield of daggers. Still, no goblets had been hurled. No screaming match had erupted. It was progress of a sort. Walking through the corridors, he decided he would speak with Joffrey that very night. He found the prince in one of the smaller salons, sprawled on a chaise while a minstrel played soft music. Several young courtiers fluttered around, hoping to gain favor with the heir to the throne. Joffrey, clad in elegant silks, looked up as Robert entered, and the boy's face tightened. "Father," he said, voice betraying surprise. "Leave us," Robert ordered the courtiers. They exchanged uncertain looks but hurried out. Even the minstrel packed up his lute and fled. Father and son were left in tense solitude. Robert approached, noticing that Joffrey had grown taller in recent months, though he still had the petulant cast to his features that Robert found off-putting. "We need to talk." Joffrey rose, affecting an air of haughty boredom. "About what, precisely?" Robert let out a long breath. "Your conduct, for one. I've heard rumors you've been bullying younger squires and threatening serving girls. That ends now. Is that clear?" Joffrey scoffed, color rising to his cheeks. "Those are petty accusations. I'm a prince. It's hardly my fault if they can't handle my words." Robert felt his temper flare. He remembered that same arrogance in Joffrey's attitude months earlier, when Robert was too drunk to properly discipline him. A prince's duty is to set an example, not to torment those beneath him. "You will stop this. If I hear more complaints, you'll answer to me." Joffrey glared, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You never cared before," he said sullenly. "What's changed?" "I have," Robert said firmly. "I won't ignore your behavior anymore. You're nearly a man, Joffrey, and if you're to rule one day, you'll do it with discipline and respect, not by terrorizing those who can't fight back." Joffrey's fists clenched at his sides. "I'll rule as I see fit when I'm king." Robert leaned in, voice low. "You'll do as I say while I'm still on the throne. Or have you forgotten who wears the crown?" The boy's eyes flicked away. Robert sensed the conflict in him, an inclination to rebel, yet also a fear of his father's strength. In the past, Robert might have struck him or yelled curses, fueling Joffrey's resentment. But this time he kept his voice controlled, letting the weight of his authority carry the message. Joffrey swallowed. "Is that all?" Robert straightened, stepping back. "For now. But mark me, boy, I'm watching. Don't give me cause to regret it." With that, he turned and left, leaving Joffrey fuming. The tension in the air crackled like static, but Robert did not look back. As the door shut behind him, he felt a hollow sense of unease. The seeds of conflict between them were too deeply planted, but perhaps he could at least contain the damage. Part of him recalled the darkest rumors about Joffrey's parentage, the possibility that he was not Robert's blood at all. Did that matter when the boy was next in line for the throne in the eyes of Westeros? He retired to his bedchamber, where he found no comfort waiting, just the silent gloom of his own thoughts. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful. He dreamed of a stag with a wounded flank, running through a dark wood pursued by an unseen predator. The next day, Robert summoned his principal advisors to discuss a new matter that had arisen. The Lord of Harrenhal had died without an heir, leaving the formidable castle and its lands in question. In years past, the castle had changed hands frequently, a symbol of power that often brought ill luck to its holders. Robert wished to settle the matter swiftly, lest it become a flashpoint for neighboring lords to vie over. Ned laid out the genealogical claims, while Littlefinger proposed an auction of sorts, hinting that the crown could profit by selling the lordship to the highest bidder. Robert disliked the idea. It felt mercenary, as if they were hawking a piece of the realm like a trinket. "Harrenhal is not a bauble," Robert said. "It's a seat of strategic importance. We need a trustworthy family in charge." Grand Maester Pycelle cleared his throat. "House Went once held it, but their line is near extinguished. There is a distant cousin in the Vale, though I doubt he has the means to maintain such a fortress." Renly tapped a finger on the table. What if we grant it to a house that has served us well recently, as a reward for loyal service? Perhaps House Lannister or House Bracken. Both are from the region. Ned frowned slightly. House Lannister is known to be loyal and just. House Bracken has a fractious history with House Blackwood. Robert drummed his fingers on the table. We could also consider House Tully or a branch thereof, though I doubt Hoster Tully wants to relinquish any strong members of his line from Riverrun. We must choose carefully. If we reward the wrong house, we could sow resentment. Baelish leaned in, eyes gleaming with the possibilities. Indeed, Harrenhal is cursed, if one believes the old stories. It swallows lords whole. Perhaps no house truly wants it. Then again, perhaps a man with ambition would take the risk. Robert ignored him for the moment, glancing at Ned. You know the Riverlands better than I do now. Who do you think is best suited? Ned considered. Lord Lannister is honorable, but he's content at Seaguard. If you offered Harrenhal, he might view it as a burden. The Brackens and Blackwoods feud constantly, and placing either in Harrenhal might spark new conflicts. There's also the possibility of a new lord from outside the region, someone who can restore order without local biases. Robert grunted, pondering. What about a cadet branch of House Baratheon, my father's cousin's line? That might strengthen the crown's hold there. Ned rubbed his chin. It could, though it also risks the appearance of the crown gobbling up prime real estate. That's better than letting Harrenhal fester, Robert said. We'll consider it. In the meantime, send some men to maintain the castle. We can't leave it unguarded. Ned made a note. Baelish looked mildly disappointed that his scheme of auctioning the castle for coin seemed to be dismissed. Robert had made up his mind, though. The crown needed stability, not a public bidding war that would sow discord. As they moved on to other topics, a page entered with a sealed letter. He handed it to Robert with a bow. Robert broke the seal, scanned the contents, and felt his expression harden. He passed the letter to Ned, who read it silently, then set it down, grim-faced. Threatening letters again? Ned asked quietly. Robert nodded. From some up-jumped lord in the Stormlands who doesn't like the new taxes. Talks of old alliances are shared past. Claims I'm betraying the region's interests by enforcing these levies. He hints he might withhold resources if we don't relent. Baelish leaned forward. Does he have any actual power to make good on his threats? Robert shrugged. He can stir trouble. Enough that we need to nip it in the bud. He turned to Ned. Send a firm reply, reminding him of his obligations and the consequences of treason. If he persists, we'll send men to ensure order. Ned nodded, already drafting the mental outlines of the response. It will be done. The rest of the day passed in a grind of administrative work. By evening, Robert felt the familiar heaviness in his limbs. He found himself longing for the quiet release of a warm bath. As he stepped away from the final meeting, Renly caught up with him, smiling brightly as though the day's tasks hadn't worn him down at all. Brother, Renly said, join me for some archery practice in the courtyard? I've been cooped up with these scrolls all day. Robert almost refused, but the idea of physical exertion appealed. All right, he said, just for a bit. They made their way to the courtyard, where a few target stands had been set up. Renly handed Robert a stout bow and selected a lighter one for himself. The king tested the string, adjusting to the tension. He had once been quite good with a bow, though he preferred the crushing might of a warhammer or sword in close combat. Still, any weapon was an extension of discipline and skill. Renly fired the first shot, hitting near the center of the target. Robert squared his shoulders, drew the bowstring back, and loosed. The arrow struck the outer ring of the target, a touch wide. Rusty, he grumbled. Renly laughed good-naturedly. You've been swinging swords and reading ledgers. Archery demands a different focus. They traded shots, exchanging banter. Renly teased Robert about the smallest thing. His stance, the set of his feet, earning mock grunts of annoyance. Yet with each arrow, Robert's aim improved, and he soon found the rhythm of breathing, drawing, and releasing. The repetition was oddly soothing, clearing his mind of the day's political tangles. When they paused to retrieve arrows, Renly spoke in a quieter tone. "I'm proud of you, you know, for not giving in to the old ways." Robert glanced at him. "Flattery, Renly? Or do you truly mean it?" Renly shrugged, a half-smile on his lips. "I do mean it. People may think me frivolous, but I see how hard you've worked. The realm is better for it, truly." Robert felt a warmth in his chest. He and Renly had never been as close as he was with Ned, but hearing such straightforward support from his brother felt good. "Thank you," he said, a bit gruffly. "Keep it up, and you'll have me thinking you want something." Renly chuckled. "Merely a stronger kingdom, dear brother." They resumed their practice until the sky grew dim. As Robert bade Renly good night and headed off to bathe, he couldn't help reflecting on how different his life had become. He was no saint. He still had flashes of rage, regrets that haunted his dreams, and tensions he had no easy solution for. But he was not the drunken sot he had been. He was a king in practice as well as in name, steadily earning the respect of his people, if not always their love. That would do. The next day brought a series of complications, as days often did. Early in the morning, a messenger arrived bearing urgent news. Lord Tywin Lannister was on his way to King's Landing with a sizable retinue, having taken a sudden journey from Casterly Rock. Rumors flew. Some said he came to demand more influence. Others whispered a possible betrothal arrangement for Myrcella or Tommen. Still others feared he might be marching in anger. But Ned's scouts reported that Tywin traveled with fewer than 100 men-at-arms, enough for protection, but not an army. Robert held an impromptu meeting with Ned and Varys to decide how best to receive Lord Tywin. Ned insisted on caution. Varys offered no direct opinions, but recounted stories of how Tywin had once arrived unannounced in King's Landing, leading to the sack of the city during the rebellion. Robert, remembering that old atrocity, felt his blood run cold. Yet this was a different time, and Tywin presumably sought to avoid open conflict. House Lannister was the wealthiest in the realm, but would they dare raise arms against a stabilized monarchy? Unlikely. Still, Robert prepared a formal welcome, ensuring the gold cloaks were on alert.